The year is 55 BC. The Roman Republic is the largest and most powerful state that the world has ever known. Its borders stretch from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. But Rome is not yet an empire governed by a single emperor. On paper, it is governed by an elected senate of representatives of the people, who in turn are led by two yearly elected consuls. In reality, however, as is usually the case with strong militaristic states, the power lies with military strong men. At this time, the first triumvirate of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had formed a strong military alliance to split power and to challenge the authority of the Senate. A triple alliance aimed at maintaining balance and with the specific aim of not allowing Rome to fall again under the sway of a single tyrant like Marius or Sulla, both fairly brutal dictators who had ruled very recently. The first triumvirate were the celebrities of their day, the likes of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, both famed military rulers who were loved by the men of their legions and also in turn by the notoriously patriotic plebeians who made up the vast majority of Rome's population at this point. Marcus Licinius Crassus, however, was cut from a different kind of clay. He was a businessman first, and whilst he justifiably had earned the reputation of being the wealthiest living Roman, and by extension, possibly the richest human who had ever lived by this point, he wasn't particularly popular with the people. He had amassed his fortune through pretty dubious means as an unscrupulous businessman, making his fortune by buying up wooden buildings damaged by fire, then having his own private firefighter army put out the flames and replace the wood with stone to sell on for a huge profit. Although Crassus had served in the military for 10 years, as to even hold office in Rome it was mandatory for someone to have done so, he was still regarded as a bit of a military failure. This is despite fighting alongside the tyrant Sulla, and even back in 71 BC, defeating the famous gladiator general Spartacus once and for all, although Pompey had appeared after the battle to round up the survivors and naturally take all the credit for it. We have to remember that Rome at this time was a martial society. Status and military power meant everything, and Crassus, now 60 years old, was determined to once and for all prove himself as the strong military ruler he was convinced that he was. So it was, in the year 55 BC, in line with the politics of the day, Crassus was granted a consulship and Syria as his province to govern. Syria was an immensely wealthy part of the empire at this time, having been populated by civilized people for thousands of years, rather than the more warlike Gauls and Germans of northern Europe who Caesar was busy battling with. Syria had many well-established cities, a strong infrastructure, and a bustling economy with which to work. Not content to sit on his wealth any longer, and desperate to prove himself as the able-bodied military commander he was convinced that he was, in 53 BC, Crassus marched out beyond the frontier into the Syrian desert, at the head of a mighty army consisting of 7 legions, as many as 40,000 to 50,000 fighting men, who were supported by an elite cadre of Gallic cavalry, led by Crassus's son Publius, who had previously served under Caesar in Gaul. Their destination? Parthia. The Parthians were the spiritual successors to the First Persian Empire. You know, the ones from 300 who waged war with the Greeks and had giants. And like their predecessors, the Parthians were immensely powerful. From their capital at Ctesiphon in modern-day Iraq, they ruled over a large empire and consistently proved to be a thorn in Rome's side, who had never managed a significant military victory against them. Crassus was determined to wipe them out once and for all, and it seems he didn't plan on stopping there. The sources suggest that, like most high-ranking Romans at the time, Crassus had an obsession with Alexander the Great, the famous Macedonian general of centuries earlier, who had carved out the largest empire the world had ever known up to that point. And Crassus wished to surpass Alexander by marching into India, and even beyond to what the Romans called the Outer Sea, the land we know now as China. Word travelled quickly of the Roman advance. After all, they weren't exactly being subtle, marching directly in a straight line as they were towards the Parthian capital. The Armenian king, Artavasdes II, who was a vassal to Rome at the time, offered his assistance if Crassus would only advance through Armenian lands. Crassus instead decided on the shortest route directly to the capital, across the Mesopotamian desert. This decision has been widely criticised by contemporaries and historians alike. But in all fairness to Crassus, I feel his thinking was that he could get straight to the capital before the Parthians could do anything about it. This being a time of uneasy peace with Rome, the Parthians were not expecting an invasion, and it would take time to assemble a large standing army. The Parthian king, Orodes II, was furious and sent riders to his leading general, Syria, to go and harass the Romans to provide him with enough time to assemble a large standing army, powerful enough to save the empire. Before long, a force of horse archers had amassed under Syria in order to combat the invasion. As the Romans made their way through the desert towards the town of Carrhae, scout reports began to filter back to Crassus of Syria's presence ahead. He was pleased to hear that Syria's force was much smaller than his own, totaling just 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 heavily armoured shot cavalry known as cataphracts. Crassus was confident of his superiority at this point. Within the conventional armies of the time which Rome had faced over the last several centuries, projectile weapons hadn't really been a decisive factor, not playing nearly as much of a role as close quarters combat and conventional cavalry. Crassus's general Cassius suggested forming into a long line so they could not be flanked by the Parthian horsemen. Initially, Crassus seems to have agreed, but soon decided instead to form up into a hollow square, a seemingly impregnable defensive formation which sacrificed mobility for defensive capability. Out on the other side of the field, Syria gazed out towards the formidable Roman war machine. Knowing that he was heavily outnumbered at this stage and with relief forces many days away, he had to force a confrontation now or lose any kind of advantage that he might have. First, he ordered his men to intimidate the enemy by beating large tribal drums. He also ordered his highly disciplined elite cataphracts to repeatedly charge at the Romans and pull away at the very last second just before engaging. Syria then threw all of his cards on the table and began his attack. He ordered his horse archers to harass the Roman forces, pelting them with thousands upon thousands of arrows. The skies darkened with the sheer amount of firepower as the Parthians fired up into the air as well as head on, making it impossible for the Romans to defend from both simultaneously. Whilst Roman armour and shields proved a great deal of protection against projectile weapons, they could not entirely cover their bodies, and gradually the Parthian bowmen began to take effect. The Parthians could even fire from behind as they moved away. An ingenious new technique which came to be called the Parthian Shot and would come to revolutionise war in the coming centuries. At this stage, Crassus gave the order to adopt the famous testudo formation, which severely affected the Romans' ability to fight in melee combat, but did provide better protection from projectile weapons. As soon as the testudo was adopted, however, Syria ordered his cataphracts to charge back into the fray and maximise his advantage. This was an utterly devastating attack for the Romans, and by the time they'd loosened up their position once more in order to combat the heavy horsemen, the cataphracts were already long gone, and the horse archers returned to take their place, raining more and more arrows upon the now exposed legionaries. Despite all the damage that the Parthians had inflicted, Crassus still seems to have been fairly optimistic at this point. After all, the Roman army was a professional force made up of career soldiers, and as such they were highly disciplined. It would take much more than this for his men to break. Crassus's thinking was probably that he could wait out the archers until they ran out of ammunition, and then strike back to win the day. However, this wasn't Syria's first encounter with the Romans, and his men already had a great deal of experience fighting with their enemy to the west. Little did Crassus know, hidden away to the west of the battlefield lay Syria's secret weapon, a baggage train of hundreds of camels loaded up with hundreds of thousands of arrows and ample supplies of water. This supply point enabled the Parthian bowmen to constantly resupply every time they pulled out of the engagement. The men would even rotate, ensuring that they remained at their utmost capacity to fight, and that the Romans were never given a moment of respite. The motives for what happened next are unclear, but we do know that during a brief lull in the fighting, Crassus sent his son and heir Publius at the head of a large force of Gallic cavalry and 10 cohorts of around 5,000 men to follow the Parthian horse archers back out into the field and cut them down. The highly disciplined horse archers, however, feigning retreat, led Publius's men far away from the main force, separating them entirely while still occasionally pelting them with arrows from behind, using the Parthian Shot. Meanwhile, Crassus, quite content with the situation, ordered the hollow square to break up and arrayed his legions in the standard battle order of a long line. Out on the other side of the field, Publius's worst nightmares were soon realised as the heavily armoured Parthian cataphracts returned to smash into his force with a devastating attack. Publius's men made a valiant last stand upon a hilltop, but the situation was hopeless. Publius, too mortally wounded to take his own life as honour dictated, ordered his armour-bearer to do the deed for him. The Parthians swiftly decapitated his corpse and took the head as a trophy. Meanwhile, Crassus, visibly horrified at the sight of his son's encirclement, ordered his men to march back into the fray and relieve them. More horse archers returned, of course, and continued to harass Crassus, who struggled to break through. It was at this stage that the now exhausted Romans were approached by yet another contingent of Parthian horsemen. To Crassus's horror, the lead rider held aloft into the air the decapitated head of his son and heir, Publius. This was the manner in which Crassus found out about his son's death, and as you can imagine, a great deal of hope seems to have been lost at this point. Yet the battle raged on until nightfall, the Parthians not letting up their relentless harrying of the Romans even for a moment. The Romans stubbornly holding on to their ground, doing what Romans did. Finally, Crassus ordered an all-out retreat to the nearby town of Carrhae, where the next day he agreed to meet Parthian envoys in order to discuss a truce. Accounts vary slightly on what happened next, but we get a pretty good idea of what happened. There seems to have been a disagreement between some of the soldiers at the meeting. In the ensuing violence, Crassus was killed. The remaining Romans, exhausted and dejected, were either captured en masse, killed, or escaped. Rome was humiliated. Crassus had cemented his position as one of the most famous Romans, but for all of the wrong reasons. Carrhae was to be known as one of Rome's worst military defeats ever, ranking up there with the likes of the Teutoburg Forest against the Germans in 9 AD and Cannae against Hannibal in 216 BC. As many as 20,000 legionaries had been killed and 10,000 captured, in addition to the loss of several legionary eagles, a huge loss for Rome. Legend even has it that the Parthian king Orodes II had Crassus's head embalmed after the battle and used as a prop in a Greek play. Whether this is true or not is debatable, but we do know that Carrhae was a huge propaganda victory for the Parthians, who had justifiably earned a reputation as being the one type of army which Rome could not defeat. A myth which was never really dispelled, despite a fair few future Roman victories against the Parthians. Indeed, the legacy of mounted horse archers would reappear many more times upon the gates of Europe in the future, in the form of the Huns, the Arabs, the Turks, and possibly most famously the Mongols. Not since Hannibal had crossed the Alps, back in the 3rd century BC, and humiliated the Romans during the Second Punic War, been such a defeat, and all for the personal glory of one man. Crassus's death and the dissolution of the First Triumvirate added to a period of existing political instability, which eventually led to a civil war, the overthrow of the Republic by Julius Caesar, and the establishment of the office of a single emperor, who would hold all the power in the empire until the fall of Rome some 4 centuries later. But what of the victorious young general, Syria, who aged just 30, against all the odds, had saved his homeland and defeated the most powerful state the world had ever known, without even needing the standing army being raised by his king? Well, as often happens in history, he proved to be a bit too popular for his own good. Orodes II, not wanting to deal with any sort of threat to his own supremacy, made sure that Syria didn't survive the year. The borders between the two empires fluctuated and shifted several times over the next few centuries, with neither side fully being able to best the other. The Parthians remained as Rome's ever-vigilant adversary. Well, thanks for watching everybody. This is the first video I've ever made, so I apologise if my pronunciations or editing are a little bit rusty. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like and comment if you did, and subscribe for much more in the future.